Okay, we are on chapter 2, The Taming of Britches Dotty, in More Adventures of the Great Brain. On Monday morning, after the Saturday that Tom had terrorized the town, Mr. Standish asked him to take the midterm examination with the sixth graders instead of the fifth graders. He said if Tom passed the examination that he would promote my brother to the sixth grade, so Tom could graduate in June. Mr. Standish always let superior pupils skip a grade if they could pass the midterm examination for the next grade. It was no trick at all for Tom to get an A, so he moved from his desk in the fifth row with the fifth graders to the last row with the sixth graders. A couple of weeks later, when Papa came home from the advocate office, he had something on his mind. He told Mama he had let a man named Charles Blake and his daughter move into the old adobe house. Mama and Papa had lived there when they first got married. It was furnished with our old furniture and had a small and large bedroom, a parlor, and a big kitchen. Papa put off telling Mama about it until we had finished eating supper. Blake? Mama asked as she rolled up her napkin and placed it in her silver napkin ring. I don't recall anybody by that name in town. How much rent is he going to pay? Papa sort of coughed like something was stuck in his throat. You know, Tina, that house has been vacant since the Palmers moved to Cedar City, Papa said. A house lasts longer when people are living in it. I see, Mama said. You told Mr. Blake he could live in the house rent-free. But why? He isn't Mormon, for one thing, Papa answered. You know how the Mormons look out for their own. If he were a Mormon, they would see to it that Blake and his daughter had a place to live and find some kind of work for the man. Well, just who is he? Mama asked. He's a wrangler who caught wild horses and broke them to the saddle or harness and sold them to ranchers, Papa answered. He owned a small spread over near the Nevada line. A few months ago, a wild horse fell on him and broke his leg in several places and also permanently injured his back so he can never ride again. What with little money he has was soon gone, and he lost his small ranch. Mama shook her head. The poor man, she said sadly. Dave Ecord gave Blake and the daughter a ride to town, Papa continued. He dropped them off at the Advocate this afternoon, thinking I might be able to help the man find some kind of work in town. Blake's injuries make it impossible for him to do any heavy work, and he can't work standing up because he has to use a crutch to get around. What kind of work could he possibly do? Mama asked. That part I took care of this afternoon, Papa said. I remember Jerry Strout telling me a few weeks ago that he was getting older and had more business than he could handle. I took Blake to see Jerry. Jerry offered to give Blake a job and teach him how to repair saddles, harnesses, and bridles in his shop. It's work that can be done sitting down, and Blake doesn't know it, but Jerry told me that if things work out, he'll sell the shop to him when he retires in a few years. Well, that was very nice of Jerry, Mama said. Papa's face became solemn. Getting Blake settled was easy to capture wild horses. He's raised her like a boy. She's about 12 years old and has never attended school. I just don't see how she will be able to adjust to life in town. It will be like a prison to her. She's like a wild creature. Her father calls her Dotty. All she needs is love and help, Mama said. It's going to take more than that, Papa insisted. I doubt if she's ever worn a dress in her life. She wears Levi breeches, a boy's shirt, and boys' cowboy boots. That is no problem, Mama said. I know several mothers who have clothing their daughters have outgrown, and Bertha and I can make the girls some dresses and things. In my judgment, Papa said soberly, she wouldn't accept them or wear them, and her father wouldn't permit it anyway. They are a proud and stubborn pair. Blake insisted I'd make out a promissory note for him to sign with an X, promising to pay me rent when he gets on his feet, before he'd move into the adobe house. Mama stared at Papa. Mr. Blake can't read or write? She asked. Ignorant but proud, Papa said. The next morning, after we'd finished our morning chores, Mama called Tom and me into our kitchen. She pointed at a bushel basket on the table. It was lined with wrapping paper. I could see a smoked ham, fruit jars, and several jars of homemade jams and jellies. You boys take this to the Blakes, she said. Tom and I grabbed hold of the wire handles and carried the basket down Main Street to 3rd Street South, where we turned left. The adobe house was in the middle of the block. As we got near it, we stopped and stared. There was a girl wearing Levi breeches, a boy's shirt, and short cowboy boots washing a window with her back turned toward us. I wouldn't have known it was a girl if it hadn't been for the yellow hair tied in a braid behind her back. We continued on and set the basket on the small front porch of the adobe house. The girl heard us and turned around. She had a round face burned a deep brown from outdoor living. Her face looked like it had been dunked in a barrel of freckles. She stared at us with unfriendly blue eyes. "I'm Tom Fitzgerald, and this is my brother John," Tom introduced us. "You must be Dotty Blake. Our mother and father welcome you and your father to Aidenville and have sent you a few things." I thought it was a very neighborly and nice speech myself, but Dottie's eyes flashed. "Us Blakes don't take charity from nobody," she said. At least she sounded like a girl when she talked. "It isn't charity," Tom said. "It's just being neighborly." "Ain't no difference," she said. "Take it back. Me and Pa don't need help from nobody." Tom shrugged as he looked at me. We picked up the bushel basket and carried it back home. We told Mama what happened after setting the basket on the kitchen floor. Mama shook her head sadly. "I guess your father was right," she said. The next morning, we went to the community church as usual because there was no Catholic church in Aidenville. A Catholic missionary priest came to town about once a year to baptize Catholic babies, marry Catholics, and hold confessions and masses for a few days in the community church. Papa said going to hear Reverend Holcomb preach at the community church was better than no church at all. Mr. Blake was there dressed in overalls and a blue work shirt, I guess because he didn't own a suit. And Dottie was there bold as brass in her Levi breeches, boy's shirt, and cowboy boots. Reverend Holcomb didn't seem to mind and welcomed them both to the congregation. "I'm going to call on the Blakes," Mama said when we returned home. "Do you think that's wise?" Papa asked. "Mr. Blake and his daughter have given every indication all they want is to be left alone." "I have every right to see how they are taking care of our house," Mama said. "I'll use that as an excuse. Then I'll try to reason with Mr. Blake that being neighborly isn't charity." This was too exciting to miss, so Tom and I waited in our parlor with Papa and Aunt Bertha until Mama returned. She looked worried and sad as she sat down in her maple rocker. "That girl has the house as neat as a pin," she said. "Then what are you worried about?" Papa asked. "It isn't the house," Mama asked. "It's that poor girl and her stubborn father. He lets her do the housework and cooking, but otherwise treats her like a son and not a daughter. He even boasted to me how he had raised her as if she were a boy, and how she could ride, use a lariat, a rifle, and other things better than a boy. I first tried to reason with him, pointing out that now they were living in town and he could treat her as a daughter and not as a son. And do you know what he said?" Papa waited as Mama paused and then asked, "How could I know? I wasn't there." Mama shook her head. "He said he liked his daughter just the way she was, and it wasn't nobody else's business how he raised her. Then I pointed out to him that living in town did have some advantages, such as enabling his daughter to get an education. And do you know what he said about that?" Papa was getting impatient with Mama as she paused again. "My dear Tina, how could I possibly know?" "He said he didn't hold with book learning," Mama said. "The man is impossible." I was 100% in favor of Mr. Blake. Any father who didn't want his kid to go to school was all right by my money. "There's nothing we can do about it," Papa said. "It is Mr. Blake's business how he raises his daughter." Mama stood up with that look of determination on her face I'd seen so many times. "I'm going to make it my business, and you are going to help me. We are going to force Mr. Blake to make his daughter go to school." "How?" Papa asked. "You will go see Calvin Whitlock and other members of the school board this afternoon and convince them it is to the best interest of Dotty Blake that she get an education," Mama said. When Papa returned home late that afternoon, he seemed in good spirits. "Well?" Mama asked. "It's all set," Papa said. "Calvin and the members of the school board, along with Mark, representing the law, will call on Mr. Blake in the morning. They will tell him the law forces all children to attend school through the 6th grade. Blake can't read, so there's no way for him to look up the law. Jerry Stout and the others Blake might ask about it have it all agreed to cooperate." The next morning, Mr. Whitlock entered our one-room schoolhouse looking very distinguished with his gray mutton chop side whiskers. He was accompanied by Dotty Blake and her father. Mr. Blake had yellow hair and a yellow mustache. His face was burned as brown as the Indian's skin. He was hobbling on a homemade crutch. "This is Dorothea Blake," Mr. Whitlock said to Mr. Standish. "She has never been to school. You will have to start with her in first grade and be patient with her." Then Mr. Whitlock and Mr. Blake left. Dotty looked scared and was biting her lower lip. She was wearing her Levi breeches, boy's shirt, and cowboy boots. Our teacher showed her to a seat in the front row with the first graders. "Welcome to our school, Dorothea," Mr. Standish said. "My name's Dotty and not Dorothea," she said. "Mr. Whitlock said your name was Dorothea, and that is what you will be called in school," Mr. Standish said with authority. "Guess my pa knows better than Mr. Whitlock," Dorothy said. "Pa calls me Dotty." Mr. Standish sort of shrugged. "All right, Dotty, if that is the way you prefer it," he said. Mr. Standish tried to include Dotty in the lesson for the first grade, but she sat with her arms folded and wouldn't answer him. When our teacher finally released us for the morning recess, Tom whispered to me, "That poor kid is in for a rough time." Tom was right. No sooner had the kids got outside on the playground when they began making fun of Dotty. Sammy Leeds was the ringleader. "Are you a boy or a girl?" Sammy asked as all the kids crowded around her. "Can't tell with those breeches, boy's shirt, and boots you're wearing." Then Marie Vincent put in her 2 cents. "Breeches Dotty hasn't got a dress to wear," she shouted and then laughed. Christine Mackey kept the insults going. "Why didn't your mother wash your hair and curl it?" she asked. "Ain't got no ma," Dotty said. "She's dead." I thought that would make the kids ashamed, but it didn't. Sammy Leeds laughed a cruel laugh. "Breeches Dotty can't read or write," he shouted. "Breeches Dotty is dumb, dumb, dumb." Then all the kids except Tom and me and Basil began to shout, "Breeches Dotty is dumb, dumb, dumb." Sammy was the worst of all, stepping right up close to her and shouting the insult right in her face. She pushed him away. "You stop making fun of me or else you'll be sorry," she said with a wild look in her blue eyes. "Sorry about what?" Sammy taunted her. "About this," Dotty shouted, and she hauled off and punched Sammy right on the nose so hard it began to bleed. All the girls began insulting Sammy because they had never seen a girl fight a boy. Marie Vincent shouted, "Sammy got a bloody nose from a girl." As if by a signal, all the girls began to shout, "Sammy got whipped by a girl. Sammy got whipped by a girl." Sammy wiped the blood from his nose with his handkerchief. He looked angry enough to explode. "If you wasn't a girl, I'd beat the tar out of you," he said through gritted teeth. "I ain't afraid to fight you," Dotty said. That was all Sammy needed. He doubled up his fists and began throwing punches at Dotty, who fought just like a boy and punched him right back. The kids began to scream and shout. This brought Mr. Standish out of the schoolhouse. Tom ran to meet the teacher with me following. "Please let them fight," Tom pleaded. "If Dotty whips Sammy, all the other kids will leave her alone." Mr. Standish thought about it for a moment and then went back into the schoolhouse. By the time Tom and I got back to the fight, Sammy and Dotty were in a clinch. I watched bug-eyed as Dotty wrestled Sammy to the ground and pinned him with her knees on his arms. She pasted him good a few times on the face. Then she scooped up a handful of dirt. "Had enough?" she asked. Poor old Sammy knew he was beat. "I give up," he said. "Then eat dirt," Dotty shouted, and she pushed the handful of dirt into Sammy's mouth. It was the worst humiliation a fellow could suffer. Sammy began to gag and spit dirt and blood from his mouth as Dotty got up. And boy, did she have a wild look in her eyes as she stared at the kids. "The next one who makes fun of me, I'll fight and make eat dirt, boy or girl," she threatened. All the kids backed away from Dotty with scared looks. Just then, Mr. Standish rang the bell, ending recess. Dotty's first day in school must have been enough to make Mr. Standish wish he'd never become a teacher. He tried several times to get Dotty learning her ABCs, but she just sat with her arms folded and wouldn't say a word. "Wouldn't you like to learn to read and write like the other pupils?" he asked. "Nope," Dotty answered, speaking for the first time that afternoon. "Wouldn't you like to learn something about history of our great country?" Mr. Standish asked. Nope, Dotty said. Wouldn't you like to learn how to add and subtract and multiply figures? Mr. Standish asked. Nope, Dotty said. My pa told me I gotta come here 'cause it's the law, but he didn't say I gotta learn anything. Mr. Standish threw up his hands. Is there anything you do like? He asked. Horses, Dotty said. I like horses. Here's a picture of Dotty. That evening after supper, Tom and I did our homework on the dining room table and then went into the parlor to play a game or two of dominoes before going to bed. Papa laid aside his book. How did Dotty Blake's first day in school go? He asked. Mama dropped her embroidery work in her lap. It was a disaster, she said, a complete disaster. Tom and I had told Mama all about it when we had come home from school. Tom repeated the story for Papa. That girl is going to get an education some way, Mama said with a determined look on her face. Tom looked at Mama with surprise. You can't make anybody do something they don't want to do, he said. Mr. Standish tried real hard, but it didn't do any good. Mama stared hard at Tom as if she'd never seen him before, and then to my astonishment, she smiled. Maybe I can't, but you can, she said. I am sure your great brain can make that girl want to get an education and want to look and act like a girl. Tom thought about it and slowly nodded his head. Maybe I could use my great brain to solve the problem, he said. Then that conniving look came into his eyes. How much would it be worth to you and Papa? Maybe we can make a deal. Mama laid her embroidery on a table and stood up. She placed her hands on her hips and addressed Tom by his full name, which meant she was pretty angry. We will make a deal all right, Tom Dennis, she said sternly. Your father and I aren't exactly stupid. We know you deceived us into getting you a bicycle for Christmas by pretending you'd reformed. The bicycle goes up into the attic immediately and stays there until Dotty Blake wants to get an education and starts wearing dresses. Now you put your great brain to work on that. Tom's mouth fell open as if Mama had just told him to pack his things and leave home and never come back. But that isn't fair, he protested. It is just as fair as you pretending you've reformed, Mama said, and I'm sure your father will back me up. I second the motion, Papa said, nodding his head. I sure felt sorry for my brother. For the first time in his life, he looked as if he wished he hadn't been born with a great brain. The first thing you must do, Mama said, is to make Dotty want to learn how to read and write. This will also involve getting her father's consent. You can begin by teaching her the ABCs as you taught John D. before he started school. The look of despair disappeared from Tom's face. You mean if I teach her the ABCs, I get my bike back? Not quite, Mama said. You will also teach her how to spell simple words and identify them until she can read simple sentences from Guffey's Reader. And I think, Papa said, that Dotty should be able to count and write numerals from 1 to 25 before you get your bicycle back. You will, of course, have the help of Mr. Standish. Tom held out his arms in a pleading gesture. You are both asking for a miracle, he protested. Then let your great brain perform one, Mama said. We'll stop right there for today.